In this video, we're going to see a quick example of how to read and write from a file in Java. Your typical program that you've written so far, right? You'll have a main, and in that main, you'll do something. And let's suppose I write something like this. System out, print line. This is a test for CSC 205. So if I run this, you've seen this many times, you know exactly what's going to happen. We're going to write to the console. But let's suppose that I've decided this is really profound and I need to write this to a file so that this doesn't just go away once I close Eclipse. I want to save a permanent record of this particular statement. So in Java, if I want to write to a file, first I need to create a file object. And I can pass in a file name there. And here I'm hard coding that the file name is example.txt, but in practice, maybe you would want this to be a parameter or something, and there's nothing stopping me from doing that. I just am hard coding it here for simplicity's sake. So you'll notice I get an error. I need to import java.io.file. Let me try to create this file. And this could potentially throw an exception. So whenever you're working with files, you definitely want to make sure you handle your exceptions appropriately. So I'm going to create a new file. Now, I already know what that file's name is going to be because I used it in I set it in the constructor. I'm going to catch any IO exception. And if that happens, there's some reasons this will happen, but on create new file, if you get an exception, it's either it can't or perhaps it already exists. And in this example, it'll be because it actually exists. And so we'll say that it's okay to continue in this case. We need to make sure that we import the IO exception. So now I'm going to create a FileWriter object, and I'll just call it FW. I'm going to pass my file object to that. And again, I need to import that. So I'm going to use that FileWriter object, and I'm going to call the write. Actually, I'll just write exactly what I wrote here. However, one thing is this is just going to write these characters. So to get a new line, I do need to put a new line character in the statement. And you'll notice here that it's saying, let's see if we can get this, that I have an unhandled exception. So I'm not handling IO exceptions here. So I'm going to surround it with a try catch block. And there we go. Again, you've got to make sure you're handling your exceptions when you're working with files. Since this is a checked exception, then Java is going to force me to handle it. And so Eclipse gave me the opportunity here just to wrap that in a try catch. And that's what you see here. So here, I don't really want to print the stack trace. I'll just print an error message that says something went wrong working with the file. So before we test this, we'll put some print line statements here so that we can see what's going on. Okay, let's run this. We have our code, and then when I run this, we create the file, we're writing to the file, we're done. And if you go to the base directory of your project, you should see an example.txt file, and you'll notice that that's empty. So that should be surprising. Notice here we wrote the program, but then as soon as that's done, we exit the program, right? Because this is the last bit of code, really. So writing to a file is slow. To make sure that we do write to the file, we can use the flush command, and the flush command will ensure that we get output to the file before we actually complete it. There's our string that we wrote to the file. And we should always close the file once we're done with it. Anytime you open resource, make sure you close it. However, you may notice there is a possibility that we wouldn't close this, because if we have an exception here, then this would actually never get called. So something to keep in mind. May be a good idea to put this in a finally block. Which of course that also now we have a problem, because notice we're not handling the exception if we close this. So you may think, well, this is kind of a pain, because now I have to make sure that I get this called in a finally block. What it wants me to do here is to, let's see if I mouse over, surround it with another try catch. And again, my code is just getting really messy with all these. So fortunately, Java provides us with something called a try with resources. Instead of putting my FileWriter line up here, I can say try FileWriter FW, and now notice that function declaration, or that variable declaration, is now inside my try with resources. And then what's nice is that once this is all done, it'll close this for me automatically. And then I need to initialize it as well. So I can go ahead and say new FileWriter. And there we go. So with a try with resources, and I'll make a note that that's what that's called, we're going to implicitly there's going to be an implicit finally block with a close. So I don't have to create a separate try catch for my close function that I call in the finally block. With a try with resources, it's going to say, hey, look, this try block has this resource. Once we're done, we're going to close it, and we're going to close it safely. We're going to catch any exceptions that happen. So that's a really nice feature of Java. And let's go ahead and put this outside the try block just in case. I think since that was the first thing there, it wasn't going to really cause any trouble, but that way we can be consistent. So now we've written to a file. This IO exception, this error kind of bugs me. It's not really just that it doesn't exist. And I think what we could do in that case is let's go ahead and just exit. In this case, we'll just do a system.exit and say that, hey, there was a problem creating the file, so exit the program. Okay, so I think that's a little better. So now let's write the file. And we're going to have something very similar to what we had above when we wrote to the file. To start off with, we'll do a try with resources block again. But this time, we're going to have a FileReader. And we need to import that. So you can see now we're importing FileReader, FileWriter, and IO exception. So you'll notice here there's some exceptions that and it's like, hey, do you want to surround this with a try block? Well, no, we just need to add a catch here. But actually, before we do this catch, you may think, well, how do I know what exception to catch? Well, here, since these are going to throw checked exceptions, they'll actually tell you. So we have an IO exception, and we have a file not found exception. So if I catch IO exception, I'm going to call it accept. Notice both of these go away, and that's because the file not found is an IO exception. So since it's a child class of IO exception, handling the IO exception handles everything. And here, let's just say writing the file. And we can actually just say the same thing here. And in fact, since we have a couple more things that can happen in this case, let's print whatever the message is. Let's also, up here, we caught this exception E. Let's name it accept. I don't like one letter variable names. So now we've created this file reader. We are catching any exceptions that may happen, but we're not really doing anything yet. So I'm going to create a new character array. So here I have a new character array of 100 characters, and I'm going to say fr read into that input. And probably I should call this input string, just because input's a common used word. I want to be clear, this is a input string. But notice it's just a sequence of characters. It's not an actual string object it reads characters from the file. So now that I've read that, so the contents of the file, I need to make a string out of input string. In fact, just to make that more clear, instead of string, I'll call it chars, just to make it clear that, hey, we're creating a series of characters, and then here I create a string out of those characters, and then that'll call the toString implicitly, so it'll print this string. So I should get the contents of the file there. And so you'll see, we create the file, we write to the file, we're done, we're reading from the file. Here's the contents of the file. And then once we do this, we can say that we're done. Again, normally you don't want to have a lot of output like this because the user is going to know that the program's done. But in this case, we're doing it because it's good to get an idea of where we are in the program as you're learning to write these programs. But certainly, no one cares that you're reading from the file. They just care that you read from it successfully. So again, these are just there for you to help track where we are in the program. They're not necessarily there as an example of, hey, this is how you should write a program. Again, output, you should be very careful with what you display. Don't annoy the user. And then let's review this. I think everything here looks good. So we'll go ahead and leave that like this. Just to maybe to give you an example. So here, if we gave something where there was a file name that wasn't there, notice we would get our error message. So here, if we give it something that doesn't exist, the file or the system can't find the file. So that part's good. So there's an example of reading and writing from a file in Java.